In the spring of 1843, a woman from Missouri packed a 10-foot wagon with 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of bacon, and everything she needed to feed her family for 5 months. She would walk most of the 2,170 miles to Oregon because the wagon was too heavy to ride in. She would cook 3 meals a day over fires made from dried buffalo dung, in the rain, in the wind, on a cast-iron skillet she dragged across an entire continent. Number 9 on this list required nothing but a wagon in motion and a bucket of milk. Number 3 was made from an ingredient she found crusted along the banks of a river with no name on any map she owned. And number 1, a supper so simple it had no real name, was so good that food historians in 2024 gave it nearly 8 out of 10. These are not the recipes Hollywood remembered. These are the ones that kept 250,000 people alive across 20 years of the most ambitious migration in American history. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 15 forgotten meals pioneer women actually cooked on the Oregon Trail. Number 15. Camp coffee. The meal that began before sunrise, every single day. Women rose before dawn and revived the prior night's fire from the ashes. Then came the first task of every morning on the trail, for 5 months straight. Green coffee beans were roasted in a dry cast-iron skillet until dark, then ground in a hand mill and brewed directly in boiling water over the open fire. The wagon train carried 5 pounds of coffee per person for the entire journey. When supplies ran short, women brewed corn or dried peas in its place and called it coffee anyway. It tasted like neither. Every pioneer diary that survived the trail mentions coffee in the first sentence. Not the scenery, not the fear, coffee, because the coffee was what separated the dark from the day. And on the Oregon Trail, that distinction kept people moving. Number 14. Cornmeal mush. The breakfast that nobody loved and nobody left behind. A cup of cornmeal stirred into boiling water until it thickened into a gray porridge. That was breakfast on most mornings of the 5-month crossing. Pioneer women had been making it since colonial times, when Americans switched from oat porridge to the corn version and called it hasty pudding in New England and mush everywhere else. It traveled as dry cornmeal, light enough to pack in quantity, and cooked in under 15 minutes over a small fire. A splash of molasses made it edible. A splash of milk from the trail cow made it almost good. Every child who grew up crossing the Oregon Trail associated the smell of it with the particular gray of early morning light on the high plains. Not fondly, but they associated it. And that meant they were still alive to remember it. Number 13. Hardtack. The bread that could outlast the journey. Flour, water, and salt. Baked hard enough to last months in a wagon box without spoiling. Pioneer women had baked hardtack before leaving Missouri because trail guides specifically recommended it as emergency bread that could survive any conditions the crossing would produce. It survived all of them. It was dense, pale, and resistant to every tooth. Trail diaries recorded the standard method for eating it. Soaked in water or coffee until soft enough to chew, or crumbled into whatever soup was available. Children along the trail called it sheet iron. Mothers called it Tuesday. A single batch, mixed in the flour sack and baked over the campfire before departure, could feed a family through the stretches between rivers where fuel was too scarce to cook anything more ambitious. Number 12. Parched corn. The survival food that fit in a pocket. Captain Randolph Marcy, whose government-issued guidebook every Oregon Trail emigrant carried, wrote that half a bushel of parched corn was sufficient to sustain one man for 30 days. Pioneer women made it before leaving. Corn kernels roasted dry in a skillet until they browned and hardened. Crushed in a mortar with sugar and cinnamon, it became what Marcy called cold flour. Mixed with water, it was a meal. Dry, it was a day's emergency ration that fit in a coat pocket. Children chewed it walking alongside the wagons on days when there was no time or fuel to stop and cook. It cost almost nothing to produce, and it weighed almost nothing to carry. On the stretches of the crossing where the trail offered nothing, parched corn was the difference between eating and not eating. Number 11. Salt pork and bacon. The grease that cooked everything else. The recommended load was 100 pounds of bacon per person. That figure made sense only when you understood that bacon on the Oregon Trail was not a side dish. It was the cooking medium, the flavor base, and the protein source for virtually every meal on the crossing. Pioneer women fried it for breakfast, and they rendered the fat to cook the biscuits, the beans, and the cornmeal mush. Nothing was discarded. Salt pork traveled in barrels packed with bran to absorb moisture, and it could cross a continent without spoiling. By the second month, trail families were eating meat that had been cured before they left Missouri, and that had survived 3 river crossings. They fried it anyway. It still tasted like meat. That was enough. First pattern break. Here is what the Oregon Trail history books consistently fail to mention. The women cooked. The history recorded the men. Between 1841 and 1869, an estimated 250,000 to 500,000 people crossed the Oregon Trail. The diaries that survived, the ones that documented what was eaten and how and under what conditions, were disproportionately written by women. They recorded the food with the precision of people for whom it was not a background detail, but the central engineering problem of every single day. How do you bake bread without an oven in the rain, with wet fuel and a sick child, and 17 miles still to go before nightfall? Pioneer women solved that problem daily for 5 months. They did not get statues. They got the next meal ready. Number 10. Saleratus biscuits. The bread that saved the trail. Saleratus was a chalk white powder, similar to baking soda, commercially available from 1840 onward. It was the ingredient that made bread possible without yeast, without time, and without a kitchen. Pioneer women mixed flour, lard, and saleratus in a bowl, added water, formed the dough, and baked it in the Dutch oven set directly on the coals. The biscuits came out pale, dense, and faintly bitter from the saleratus, and they were the closest thing to real bread that the trail produced. When the commercial powder ran out, women gathered a white crystalline crust that formed naturally around certain soda springs near the Sweetwater River. It worked. It was slightly more bitter. Nobody complained. On a crossing that required 15 to 20 miles of walking per day, a hot biscuit at supper was not comfort food. It was fuel. Number 9. Wagon-churned butter, the accident that fed families for 5 months. Every morning after milking the trail cow, pioneer women poured fresh milk into sealed buckets and hung them from the underside of the wagon. They did not churn it by hand. They walked. The wagon rocked and jolted over the rough trail for 15 miles. By the time the train stopped for the evening, the cream had separated and churned itself into butter from the constant motion of the crossing. This was not an accident they discovered on the trail. It was a technique trail guide specifically recommended. Fresh butter in a community that had been eating salt pork and hardtack for 3 weeks was not a luxury. It was a morale event. Pioneer diaries record the evenings when the butter came out with the same warmth other diaries reserve for holidays. Number 8. Corn pancakes. The morning meal that required skill and speed. Cornmeal, saleratus, salt, an egg if the trail hens were cooperating, buttermilk if the cow had been milked. Mixed together in the tin bowl, poured by spoonfuls onto a smoking hot cast iron skillet greased with bacon fat. The edges came out lacy and thin where the batter spread thin, and the center stayed thick and dense. The whole operation took 8 minutes, over a campfire that took 12 minutes to build. Trail diaries recorded the most accomplished pioneer cooks by their ability to produce breakfast for 12 people in under 30 minutes before the wagon train moved. Some women, trail accounts noted, became so confident with the skillet that they flipped their pancakes in the air and caught them on the way down. On a crossing that stripped away every comfort, that small performance mattered. It meant someone still cared enough to try. Second pattern break. Here is what the weight limit meant in practice. The recommended wagon weight was 2,000 pounds. Food alone for one family of 4 could weigh between 1,300 and 1,800 pounds. That left almost nothing for everything else. Pioneer women spent months before departure making choices. Which cast iron pots came and which stayed behind. Which quilts made the cut and which did not. Which foods packed enough calories per pound to justify the space. The Dutch oven made the crossing because nothing else could do what it did. The iron stove did not, because the Dutch oven could replace it. Every item that rolled west in a prairie schooner had been argued over, weighed, and justified by a woman who understood that 2,000 pounds was not a guideline. It was a law of physics enforced by the crossing itself. Wagons that were too heavy broke axles. Broken axles killed families. The women knew this. They packed accordingly. Number 7. Trail bean stew. The pot that simmered all day and waited at the end. Half a bushel of dried beans was the recommended minimum for the crossing. Pioneer women started the beans soaking the night before, then set the Dutch oven on the coals as the wagon moved, letting the pot simmer through the day's travel. By evening, the beans had broken down into a thick, smoky broth perfumed by salt pork and a spoonful of molasses that caramelized into something almost sweet. The combination of beans, rendered pork fat, and molasses was the supper that trail diaries mentioned most consistently across every year of the crossing. Not because it was exciting, because after a 15-mile walk, a hot bowl of something thick and smoky was not a meal, it was a reason to keep going tomorrow. Number 6. Bread on a stick. The recipe that needed nothing except a branch. When the Dutch oven was full of beans and there was no time to bake biscuits, pioneer women mixed flour and water right in the flour sack, pulled out a thick portion of dough, twisted it around the end of a green stick, and held it over the fire until it cooked through. They used no pan and no lid, and there was no preparation beyond a stick and a fire. The outside charred slightly, and the inside stayed soft and slightly doughy. Children ate it walking. Adults ate it standing. It required nothing of the cook except the understanding that bread in any form, made in any way, under any conditions, was better than no bread at all. On a crossing that taught that lesson on day 2 and reinforced it every day after, bread on a stick was not a recipe. It was a philosophy. Number 5. Dried apple pie. The dessert nobody expected and everyone remembered. Dried apples traveled in burlap sacks that weighed almost nothing and survived months in a wagon box without spoiling. Simmered in water with sugar and a pinch of cinnamon, they plumped back into something that resembled fruit enough to fill a pie made in the Dutch oven with a simple flour and lard crust pressed into the bottom and laid over the top. It baked in the coals in 20 minutes. It came out golden and faintly sweet and slightly caramelized at the edges where the crust met the filling. Pioneer diaries that mentioned it used the word festive. Not good. Festive. Because on a crossing where the food was almost entirely functional, something sweet and warm in a crust felt like something that only happened at celebrations. Dried apple pie was the Oregon Trail's way of saying the day had gone well enough to deserve a reward. Number 4. Fresh buffalo stew. The meal that required the right kind of luck. When hunting went well on the high plains, pioneer women received something no supply list had accounted for: fresh meat. Buffalo taken by the men walking alongside the wagons was butchered immediately and brought to the camp cook. She cut it into pieces, browned it in the Dutch oven in bacon fat, added water and wild onions if they could be found, and let the whole pot simmer until the tough prairie meat became tender enough to eat without breaking a tooth. The fat rendered out and flavored the broth. The bones went back in for a second pot the next morning. Nothing was wasted. On a crossing where fresh protein was the exception rather than the rule, buffalo stew appeared in trail diaries with a warmth that beans and hardtack never produced. It tasted like the plains had finally offered something in return. Number 3. Saleratus bread from the river. The ingredient nobody packed because nobody knew it was there. Between the Sweetwater River and the South Pass, emigrants on the Oregon Trail discovered something that no guidebook had mentioned and no merchant had sold. Around certain springs, a white crystalline powder formed naturally in crusts along the water's edge. Natural sodium carbonate, the same compound as saleratus. Pioneer women scraped it from the ground, dissolved it in water, and used it to leaven bread on evenings when the commercial supply had run out. The bread it produced was slightly more bitter than saleratus bread from a tin. Nobody minded. Helen Carpenter, whose trail diary documented the crossing with the precision of a woman who took nothing for granted, wrote that the pioneers had become impervious to what would kill ordinary mortals. She was right about the food, too. Third pattern break. Here is the number that changes everything you think you know about the Oregon Trail. 500,000 people. That is the high estimate of how many crossed between 1841 and 1869. 250,000 is the conservative count. Either way, most of them arrived. Most of them ate these 15 meals in rotation for 5 months and kept walking. And at the end of the journey, it was not the men's accounts that documented what had been survived. It was the diaries. Written at night, after the fire was banked and the children were asleep and the next day's beans were already soaking. By women who had figured out how to feed a family across a continent with a cast iron pot and a flour sack. And who wrote it all down so nobody would forget. Number 2. Trail ice cream. The impossible dessert that actually happened. Between the Sweetwater River and South Pass, the trail ran through a stretch called Ice Springs. In the summer of 1849, the ground still held ice from the previous winter, buried just below the surface. Travelers dug down with whatever tools they had. They found clean ice. Pioneer women mixed trail milk with sugar and whatever flavoring was available, like peppermint oil, molasses, or dried fruit. They packed the mixture into containers, buried the containers in the ice, and came back an hour later. They had ice cream on the Oregon Trail in the middle of the Wyoming high desert. In 1849, a traveler named Dr. William Thomas recorded the event in his diary. He called it one of the most welcome surprises of the entire crossing. The children did not need the context explained. They ate it before anyone finished the sentence. Number 1. Pinto beans, salt pork, and biscuits. The supper that earned 8 out of 10. A pot of pinto beans soaked overnight. Salt pork and a spoonful of molasses added in the morning. The Dutch oven moved with the wagon for 15 miles, simmering on low coals the whole way. By evening, the beans were thick and smoky, and slightly sweet where the molasses had caramelized into the broth. Saleratus biscuits baked in the same coals. The biscuits went into the bowl. The bean broth went over the biscuits. Food writers who reconstructed this meal recently from Captain Marcy's 1859 guidebook gave it nearly 8 out of 10. They were eating it sitting down in a warm kitchen. Pioneer women made it after walking 15 miles in the rain with a sick child and a broken wagon wheel. They made it with the same ingredients, in the same order, and it was still a very good meal. Not because of the recipe, because of who made it, and what it cost to make it. Here is the challenge. Make the trail supper this week. Pinto beans soaked overnight, simmered with salt pork and a spoonful of molasses for 3 hours. Saleratus biscuits in a cast iron pan. Tell me in the comments if the biscuits taste different from every other biscuit you have ever made, because they do. And if your grandmother or great-grandmother came west in a wagon or knew someone who did, I want to hear what recipe she carried. Because somewhere in this country, there are women whose great-great-grandmothers cooked all 15 of these meals across 2,170 miles. Not one of those meals was ever written down in a cookbook. They lived in the diaries, written at night after the fire went out by women who were already planning tomorrow's breakfast. That is not just cooking. That is the whole story of how this country got built.